Hi guys, I'm Brandon. I appreciate you having me here today. I will continue on the discussion of virtual fence. So Chad hit on a lot of really cool things. His stuff is a little more experimental. We've approached things from a more applied standpoint and seeing how they'll work. As a walkthrough, I'm going to talk about some basics, sort of how this fence works. There's a lot of behavioral stuff that should be noted because this is all going to have an influence on how the technology works. We'll discuss some applications. Just a collection of these and how we're opportunistically trying these out on the Santa Rita Experimental Range. And last, we'll go into some implementation stuff, sort of considerations you need to take into account when trying to use this technology. So first and foremost, the technology uses three components. We have the GPS location that's provided by the caller, a boundary that you make with the producer, with the manager, and of course, this behavioral component, which uses some core sort of tenets of operant conditioning using negative reinforcement to either elicit a avoidance or escape response by the animal. So along those boundaries are going to be two management zones. The first management zone is going to pair an auditory and a shock stimuli, and the second one's going to be auditory only. When we train these animals over the first 2 days, this is using the Vence's approach to training, we introduce them to both of these pairings. This is trying to sort of classic condition a unconditioned stimulus with this neutral auditory stimulus. After 2 days of doing that, this basically is repeating a escape response by these animals. This is normally paired alongside a physical fence, sort of forcing them to repeat a turnaround escape behavior. After those 2 days, we introduce an auditory only. This gives them an opportunity to predict and respond appropriately and turn around as well. Repeating this strengthens that response to that auditory stimuli, and that creates some pressure, preventing them from moving through that barrier. So from an application standpoint, there's some very obvious ones, exclusions. You can have an area deemed too risky to have animals in. You can either place a barrier right alongside this or encapsulating that area, but impeding any access into it. These are incredibly versatile, as in if you need this only active for a very specific set of time, you could turn it on at a specific point, turn it off later on. And then also these boundaries are really adjustable. They're adjustable in real time, and at the end of the year, which is sort of what I would, oh, sorry, I walk around a lot. Yeah, these boundaries are very adjustable. I would recommend doing it every year, seeing how it works out, and then making adjustments to sort of try to increase the efficacy of that fence. From a more adaptive standpoint, these can be paired alongside existing physical fences, areas that haven't been maintained properly. You can slap fence right on top of those, increasing or buffering the ability of animals to move through those openings. And additionally, sub-pasturing. So we could take a fence, slap it right in the middle of a pasture, and increase or concentrate the activity on one side before opening up the entire pasture. Lastly, there's some management things we can do. Of course, there's targeted grazing, fuel reduction, as we just saw in Dr. Boyd's presentation. Another really cool thing is just knowing where all your cattle are, getting all these GPS locations and seeing how distribution is occurring across that entire pasture. And a sort of gold standard is potentially using this technology to plan a virtual rotation and move cattle between pastures without any effort. Before we jump into any examples, I do want to draw some comparisons between physical and virtual fencing. Up front, there's going to be some fairly high costs to physical fencing, both with the installation and with the long-term maintenance. On the opposite side, with the virtual fencing, there is this upfront cost. It's fairly moderate. Boyd mentioned $12,500 per gateway. When it comes down to maintenance, that's fairly low. You're looking at only a few gateways per pasture or allotment. And when it comes to maintaining fence lines, it's easy as clicking a button. So there's not any cost there. Another big difference is in their ability to prevent movement across these fences. So physical fences have a very good likelihood of preventing cattle from moving across them. With virtual fencing, that's not 100%. This is going to be a product of the training, a product of that animal's history with virtual fencing, and additionally, the incentives on either side of this virtual fence. All that's going to play into a factor of whether or not this animal has enough incentive to want to try to break through that virtual boundary. Another big difference, though, is if they do make it across that boundary, like Boyd had just mentioned, they're not entrapped within that boundary. They have free access to move right across. Whereas with the physical fence, they do have an opening, they make it inside it, whether it's a new pasture or an exclosure. They're now entrapped. We either don't know where they're going, they're gone, they're long gone, or they stay and they concentrate their grazing in a very small location, which can be bad. So on the Santa Rita Experimental Range, we have a small pilot herd going on right now. These are a collection of panels showing the training of 20 individuals. In the very first panel, we let the cattle go, run wherever they wanted to go, and just to see what parts of this pasture they're selecting for. After about 15-ish days, we introduced the training over a course of 3 days. So 2 days where we did the shock and an auditory stimuli pairing, and then the auditory for that third day. After which we tried to use the virtual fence that confine them in a specific area. And this was largely because we wanted to restrict access to a road, so the rancher had better access to leave and come from his private property. You do see in that very top left corner, there was a breach, but this was a small breach. And like Boyd and I have mentioned, once these animals do surpass that barrier, they have the ability to graze that area, and they're not at all pressured at all to come back in until they do. And after a course of 5 days, we did recapture and had very good compliance within that virtual fence zone. An additional 5 days went by and we needed to move them. So we took this as an opportunity to try to use the virtual fence to capture and then move them into, or passively move them into a new pasture, new adjacent pasture. So we threw a little V right around a water source. That was the incentive to capture them. We had very good compliance in that context. They came in, they were stuck. We opened a fence and let them passively move into the next pasture. We could monitor an online herd manager application, and then we could see when they had all moved in and just close the fence. So very low investment on our side, and it worked out fairly well. We also took this as a new opportunity to sort of try to confine them in a notch in that pasture and to see if we could really evenly and densely graze that particular notch. So the yellow in that far bottom right panel is going to be physical fence. The top left is going to be the virtual fences that we use to try to retain them inside that pasture. We had fairly good compliance. We had 5 individuals that did make it through that pasture. They never returned because of other water sources in that pasture. But for the vast majority of those animals, we did contain them inside that pasture for, I think it was roughly 5 days. And we had fairly even distribution that was dense across the entire thing. So this is really neat because over the course of a month, we were able to train them and then use the fence immediately to corral and then move them between pastures. So quite a success. So in this one, so we've continued on our pilot study. We've added an additional 40 individuals, and we moved them into a new pasture. And our goals in this case is we wanted to try to we wanted to subpasture this larger pasture and see if we could contain this herd in a part of the pasture that is normally not grazed. This part of the pasture that's normally not grazed is also immediately adjacent to our riparian area. So we wanted to fence out that and see if under this artificially elevated grazing density, we wanted to see if that prevented access to that riparian area. This is like 4 or 5 days immediately after that virtual fence. And through this, you'll be able to see, yeah, it's going. Cool. Through this, you'll be able to see these individual animals moving around, interacting with that fence. And you will see individuals crossing over, but we do eventually capture those guys. And it's sort of like a situation where we're hoping to reinforce or redo that experience so they can further be captured. Of course, this is going to vary, and it's, of course, a product of their experience with these virtual fences. A lot of these individuals had different amount of interactions while being trained, and a lot of these individuals have, I guess you could say, different personalities. And there was also the opportunity that inversions, like Boyd had mentioned earlier, inversions could have occurred, which we were not aware of. Regardless, though, over that 4 days, we did have a higher amount of instances of grazing of cattle appearing in that southeast subpasture. Oh, we're jumping around. You guys are getting. In the next slide, once I get there, we have 2 months, roughly 2 months of activity across that entire pasture. Come on. All right. It's because we wanted to, first of all, we wanted to see, it's actually 15, not 45. We wanted to see just how grazing or how cattle activity sort of appeared in this pasture before we turned on this fence. We had roughly 325% more activity in that top northwest pasture prior to enabling that fence line. Following that fence line's activation, we see a flip. So like a direct flip in that activity. This does appear to decrease as time goes on. And this could be a part of the incentives that we talked about earlier. As forage is depleted in that bottom right part of the pasture, there are more incentives for them to want to push against that barrier and move up. One thing that was really nice to note is that in the riparian area, even under a higher density, we had no access to that riparian area. To be noted though, this is during winter in Arizona. That's not the biggest demand. They don't really necessarily want to be in the riparian area, but we did see that we had complete exclusion in that case. So that was what we've been doing so far on the Santa Rita Experimental Range, but we should also talk about implementation. This is sort of I think, some of the most important parts. And we've talked about incentives. You want to know your land, you want to know where water sources are, you want to know where areas with higher productive capacities are. And these are going to basically establish how you can plan your virtual fences, how you're going to capture individuals or contain them in one part of a pasture or the other. Knowing your fence lines is really important. You don't want to like throw up a virtual fence right next to an existing fence without knowing it's there, because you have this potential ping-ponging these cattle between a spiky fence and a shocky fence, and that's not going to be good for their relationship with that virtual fence. And then next, you need to know your goals, whether it's just knowing where your cattle are or knowing how you're going to use these fences with whatever management goals you have. This is all going to play into the limitations the technology has in itself. So Chad Boyd talked about this earlier, but the basic idea is that we have two devices that are going to connect with your online herd application. The collar is going to relay the location, the state of the collar, whether or not the shock or the sound is active, the battery life of that collar. And then through the opposite direction, you can group these herds into virtual herds and then assign virtual plans to them. So the biggest bottleneck in the system is going to be the gateway. This is how all the information is going to travel between you and that collar. And that's going to be a product of where you can place it. And that placement is going to decide the coverage over that entire area. So this is a real quick cellular coverage map of Arizona with AT&T and Verizon. This is going to, as you can see across Arizona, there's pretty good coverage. I love it, I have Verizon. But there are certain areas that have fairly low cellular coverage. For instance, the Kaiba National Forest is fairly spotty, the White Mountains. And in these locations, you can expect that the choices, the locations you can choose from are reduced. So you don't have as many options to try to refine that coverage map. And what I mean by refining that coverage map, we have an example here. These are two modeled lower coverage maps for two locations on the Santa Rita Experimental Range. Green's going to be good coverage, blue spotty, and areas that have no color at all are going to have no coverage. And we had to choose between these two locations. You can see these are not too far apart, but there's a drastic loss in coverage in that second one, as in the entire top right corner of the Santa Rita Experimental Range was receiving no coverage. And this is incredibly important because if you don't have any coverage, you have no way of getting any information from that collar or updating the collar as you see fit. So this plays a big part in just knowing where your cattle are at, but it also plays a big part into knowing how well your virtual fences are working. So you can upload a virtual fence on board while they're inside this green area, and that'll work independently of whether or not you have this connection. The only problem is you don't know how well it's working. So when you plan to get these gateways, put them out onto your property, is incredibly important to try to maximize this area so you always know what's happening. And then there's also some considerations to take with just the GPS itself. So between these, the two things that are going to be affected are going to be the interval of collection and then the precision and accuracy of that collection. Intervals can be collected within however long you want it. In Chad Boyd's case, he did 5 minutes. We do 30 minutes. This is usually a battery issue kind of constraint. But that interval in an open grassland is going to be fairly consistent. Once you start increasing the density of the canopies, we're going to see a large increase. It was cited in one paper that high density canopies can increase that interval up to 312%. You can imagine a 30-minute interval, 312% is quite a big jump. The big problem there is it's either going to confine your points to specific locations where high density doesn't exist, where it's very low density canopies, or we're going to just overwrite that request and then lose that information entirely. So our maps could, we might think that we might think our cows are in one location. These heat maps might indicate that activity is in one location, but that might not be the case. Another problem is accuracy and precision. It's going to be affected by canopy as well. And this not only affects where your cattle are, but it's also going to affect the relationship this cow has with that virtual fence. The ability of this collar to apply a stimulus is going to be a product of it knowing whether it's inside this auditory only management zone or if it's in the paired management zone. As this animal approaches this barrier, it's going to increase the GPS points, which will increase accuracy. But we still have the issue where these areas with low density canopies are going to have more points. And that error can be quite large. In some cases, it can jump upwards to 100 meters. These virtual boundaries can be, they're determined by you, but upwards to 100 meters. If you have a ghost cow appearing past that boundary, like we said, it turns that boundary off. So you have no pressure preventing the animal from moving through it, which can be quite a problem if you're trying to use that fence to stop them. So I've listed off a bunch of limitations, and I don't want to get your hearts, too hurt. There's still a ton of potential that these things can provide. Just knowing where the cattle are within that lower coverage area is going to provide a ton of accountability for any grazing plan. We'll know where the cattle are, if they're in the right pasture, if they've moved to the right pasture at the right time, if they've escaped and gone somewhere else. We can use the GPS information to pair with utilization maps to have a better idea of utilization across the entire pasture. This is all going to better refine our rotation plan. Of course, there's also these barriers. Well, we can pair them with physical fence, if anything, creating a buffer, lessening our dependency and reliance on these physical fences, while also allowing us to more systematically approach maintaining them. And then, of course, there's the impeding of movement into these areas that we have more conservation or management concern associated with. And then additionally, there's some gateway synergies. It's not just getting the ability to manage your cattle in this very detailed fashion, but we can also look at putting more devices out there and using these gateways to potentially pull in more information within that lower coverage area, all of which can help us manage our herd better. And that's all I got.